The champagne tasted like regret. Julien took another sip anyway, letting the bitter fizz burn the back of his throat. It gave him something to focus on besides the suffocating weight of 300 pairs of eyes, each one dissecting him, cataloging his failure, wondering how long it would take before he shattered. The Ashford Autumn Charity Gala was always a soulless affair. Held in the penthouse ballroom of the Sterling Hotel, it smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner, expensive perfume, and the particular brand of desperation that clung to people desperate to prove they still mattered. Crystal chandeliers cast cold, unforgiving light across the room, illuminating silk gowns and tailored tuxedos while guests circled like sharks, waiting for blood. Julien stood near a towering ice sculpture of a phoenix, watching it slowly weep onto a bed of crushed ice. He felt a profound kinship with the melting bird. Beautiful once, perhaps, frozen in a moment of triumph. Now just dripping away, losing form, becoming nothing. He shouldn't have come. Everyone knew it. He could see it in the tight, pitying smiles of the women who passed him. The ones who used to invite him to their charity luncheons, who'd coo over his engagement ring and ask when the wedding would be. He could see it in the averted gazes of the men who used to shake his hand and ask about his architecture firm, who'd clap him on the shoulder and call him one of the good ones. 6 weeks ago, he'd been half of a power couple, Julien and Marcus. They'd been practically a single syllable in this social circle. The golden alpha and his accomplished omega. The fairy tale. The poster children for what happened when breeding, ambition, and good looks aligned perfectly. Now Julien was just the omega who didn't see it coming. He shifted his weight, the ball of his right foot throbbing against the unforgiving sole of his custom Italian loafers. His tuxedo, midnight blue, perfectly tailored, purchased 3 days ago in a fit of defiant rage, felt like armor he wasn't qualified to wear. I will not hide, he told himself in the fluorescent glare of the fitting room. I am not the one who did something wrong. Beautiful sentiment. Completely useless in practice. The scent of the room was overwhelming. Hundreds of bodies packed into close quarters, a cacophony of pheromones that made his omega senses ache. The sharp bite of expensive alpha colognes, the sweet floral undertones of omega perfumes, the neutral chemical scent of beta suppressants. All of it mingled into a nauseating cocktail that made his head pound. Normally, Julien could filter it, ignore it. But tonight, his suppressants had worn off hours ago, and he'd been too consumed with dread to remember to reapply. The scent of 300 strangers pressed against his senses like a physical weight, and underneath it all, he could still catch phantom traces of. No, he wouldn't think about that. He wouldn't think about Marcus's scent, the warm cedar and spice that had once meant home. He wouldn't think about how it had changed in those final weeks, laced with the cloying sweetness of someone else. A sudden shift in the room's ambient noise pulled him from his thoughts. The low hum of polite conversation dipped, then spiked into a sharp, jagged static of whispers. The wealthy were never as subtle as they believed themselves to be. Heads turned toward the grand entrance. Shoulders angled. Glasses were lowered. Julien didn't need to look. His stomach had already dropped, hitting the floor with a dull, sickening thud. His omega instincts screamed at him. Danger, threat, flee. But he forced himself to stand still, to breathe, to remember that he was not prey. He was a man. He was a partner at one of the city's most prestigious architecture firms. He had designed half the buildings these people worked in. He had nothing to be ashamed of. Marcus had arrived. He didn't just walk into a room. He occupied it. He had always possessed that arrogant, easy stride, the walk of an alpha who had never been told no and actually believed it. Julien turned his head a fraction of an inch, just enough to catch his reflection in the mirrored pillar beside the bar. Marcus wore a custom charcoal tuxedo, the lapels catching the chandelier light. He looked effortlessly handsome, perfectly groomed, utterly untroubled. But it wasn't Marcus that caused the whispers. It was the man clinging to his arm. Derek. Julien felt a cold sweat break across the nape of his neck. Derek was younger, 25 to Julien's 32. a junior associate at Marcus's venture capital firm. Omega. Pretty in that generic, Instagram influencer way. When Julian had first found the texts, paragraphs of hollow, cloying desperation sent at 3 in the morning, he'd almost laughed. It was such a miserable cliché. The alpha boss and the Omega subordinate. The late nights at the office. The sudden, unexplained business trips to Boston. Confronting Marcus hadn't yielded an apology. It had yielded a lecture. Marcus had stood in the kitchen they'd remodeled together, leaning against the marble island, and told Julian that they'd simply outgrown each other. He'd made it sound like an administrative error, an unfortunate but necessary business decision. "You're a brilliant Omega, Julian," he'd said, his tone infuriatingly condescending. "But you've become predictable, stagnant. I need someone who challenges me." Translation: Marcus needed someone young and pliable who would stroke his ego and never question his authority. And now here they were, making their society debut. Derek was wearing a dress, a daring choice for a male Omega at this event, but it was the kind of fashion-forward statement that would be praised on the cover of Vanity Fair. The color of crushed pearls, it clung to him in ways that demanded attention, emphasizing his slender waist and the delicate curve of his neck. He was smiling, but it wasn't a nervous smile. It was the smile of an Omega who knew exactly whose territory he was walking on and relished the crunch of the grass beneath his heels. Julian gripped his champagne flute, his knuckles turning white. Don't look at them. But he couldn't look away. He was frozen, caught in the headlights of his own destruction. Jules. Julian didn't flinch. His best friend, Sienna, materialized at his side, her hand pressing a fresh glass of champagne into his grip. She was a beta, her scent blessedly neutral, clean soap and expensive shampoo. Safe. Grounding. "I'm not looking," Julian lied, his voice tight. "You're glaring at a mirror, darling. It's close enough." Sienna took a heavy drink of her own champagne, her dark eyes scanning the room with the strategic assessment of a corporate lawyer. She was the only person in this building who was genuinely on his side, and even she couldn't shield him from what was coming. "I can't believe he actually brought him," she muttered. "He told the board he was coming solo. I heard him say it." "He lied. He's good at that," Julian said flatly. "He probably planned this specifically to see if I'd run out the back door. Are you going to?" Julian looked down at his hands. They were trembling, just a fraction. It was infuriating. He was a successful architect. He designed the city's new opera house, for God's sake. He'd won awards. He'd been on the cover of Architectural Digest. And yet, the sight of the alpha who had shared his bed for 5 years, casually parading the instrument of his humiliation, made him want to crawl under the heavily draped catering tables and never come out. "No," Julian said, forcing the word out of his tight throat. "If I leave, he wins. He gets the narrative." "He's making a beeline," Sienna warned, her voice dropping an octave. 3 o'clock. Julian turned slowly. He refused to be caught darting his eyes away like a frightened Omega. He squared his shoulders, feeling the cold silk of his tuxedo slide against his skin, and faced the inevitable. The crowd parted for Marcus and Derek. Not out of respect, out of morbid, predatory curiosity. The guests were sharks circling a drop of blood in the water. They wanted a front-row seat to the collision. As Marcus closed the distance, Julian studied his face. There was no hesitation, no guilt. His expression was shaped into a mask of polite, patronizing concern, the face he used when firing mid-level management. His scent was carefully controlled, beta sweet, betraying nothing. But beneath the artificial neutrality, Julian caught the faintest trace of smug satisfaction. He was enjoying this. "Julian." Marcus stopped exactly 3 feet away, the socially acceptable distance for strangers. "Marcus." Julian's voice was steady. A small victory, but he took it. Derek stood pressed against Marcus's side, his hand resting flat against his alpha's chest. A deeply territorial gesture. His gaze swept over Julian, taking in the midnight blue tuxedo, the simple haircut, the bare ring finger. Derek's scent was a cloying mix of jasmine and vanilla, the kind of sweet, submissive perfume designed to appeal to powerful alphas. Julian had to suppress a gag reflex. "Hi, Julian," Derek said, his voice breathy, coated in a sugary sweetness that made Julian's teeth ache. "It's so brave of you to come out tonight." The word hung in the air. Brave. It was a surgical strike. It painted Julian as the wounded Omega, dragging himself out of the house against all odds. It established Derek as the benevolent victor, gracious enough to acknowledge his predecessor's courage. Sienna scoffed quietly beside him, but Julian put a subtle hand out to stop her. This was his fight. "It's a charity gala, Derek, not a war zone," Julian said, his tone conversational, utterly devoid of heat. "Bravery isn't really required. Just an invitation, which I assume you had to ask Marcus to secure for you." Derek's sugary smile faltered for a second, a brief tightening of the skin around his eyes. Marcus stepped in smoothly, ever the mediator in conflicts he himself created. "Now, Julian, there's no need for that." Marcus's tone was gentle, the condescension suffocating. "We saw you standing here by yourself. We just wanted to come over and say hello, to show there are no hard feelings." "No hard feelings," Julian repeated. The words felt foreign in his mouth. "Exactly." Marcus nodded. "We're all adults here. Things end. People move on. I'm glad to see you're keeping busy." He looked at Julian with profound, hollow pity. That was the worst part. He didn't hate Julian. He simply didn't care about him anymore. He had discarded him like a failed investment, and now he wanted the public absolution of Julian's polite greeting. He wanted everyone in the room to see that Marcus was a gentleman, checking in on his unstable, bitter ex-fiancée. "I'm keeping very busy, Marcus," Julian said evenly, "though I don't recall needing your approval on my schedule." He took a sip of his champagne, his heart hammering against his ribs in a violent, chaotic rhythm. But he kept his breathing slow, measured, controlled. "It's just sad, is all," Derek chimed in, leaning heavier into Marcus. "Seeing you over here, hiding by the ice sculpture. Marcus told me how you get at these things, anxious. He said you always needed him to hold your hand. It was a violation. To hear his private vulnerabilities, confessed in the quiet dark of their shared bedroom, whispered during panic attacks and stressful nights, weaponized by the Omega who slept in that bed now. Julian felt a hot flush of anger rise in his cheeks, the edges of his vision blurring slightly. The people standing near them had stopped pretending to talk to each other. They were openly eavesdropping. Julian could hear the clinking of glasses, the soft rustle of expensive fabric, the silence of the audience pressing down on him like a physical weight. "I think," Julian started, his voice dangerously thin, "that you should both walk away." Marcus sighed, a heavy, performative sound. He looked around the room, making eye contact with a few of his golfing buddies, shaking his head slightly. "Look at him. So emotional. We're just trying to be civil, Julian. You're making a scene." The gaslighting was so blatant Julian almost laughed. Marcus had orchestrated this entire encounter, planned it down to the last detail, timed it to maximize Julian's humiliation, and now he was pretending Julian was the one being unreasonable. "You always do this," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a stage whisper. "You take something small and you escalate it. I remember that time at the Whitfield's Christmas party. You got upset because I was talking to someone else for 10 minutes. Remember how you cried in the bathroom?" The memory hit Julian like a slap. That was 3 years ago. He'd been pregnant, just 2 months along, hadn't even told Marcus yet. The hormones had made him emotional, and when he'd seen Marcus flirting with an investment banker at the party, he'd had a breakdown in the powder room. He'd miscarried 2 weeks later, and Marcus had been too busy to come to the hospital with him. "Get out," Julian said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "Get out of my space, Marcus. Now. See? There it is. The famous Julian Hayes temper." Marcus turned to the crowd, offering them a helpless shrug. "He's always been high maintenance. I should have known it wouldn't work out. Gaslighting. Right here in the middle of the Ashford Gala." Julian opened his mouth, the sharp, vitriolic words ready to spill out. He wanted to scream. He wanted to throw the cheap champagne directly into Marcus's arrogant, perfectly shaved face. He wanted to tell the whole room what Marcus had done. The affairs, the emotional abuse, the way he'd made Julian doubt his own reality for years. But if he did, Marcus won. He'd be the victim of the crazy, jealous Omega X. Everything Julian had worked for, his reputation, his business partnerships, his carefully constructed identity as a composed, professional Omega, would crumble. He was trapped. And then the temperature in the room seemed to drop. It wasn't a sudden silence this time. It was a physical recession of the crowd. The guests pressing in on them suddenly took a collective step back. The murmurs died entirely, replaced by a tense, electric stillness. A shadow fell over the small circle they'd created. Julian didn't look up immediately. He smelled him first. A clean, sharp scent of cedar, crushed leaves, and expensive leather. It cut through the stale perfume and gin of the ballroom like a knife. But underneath the careful grooming, there was something else. Something darker. The scent of power, of danger, of an alpha who had never needed to prove anything to anyone. He isn't making a scene, Marcus. The voice was a deep baritone, quiet, but possessing an absolute, terrifying authority. You are simply boring him. And frankly, you're boring me. Marcus turned, irritation flashing across his features. He was ready to dress down whoever had interrupted his performance, but the words died in his throat. His jaw locked. The arrogant ease drained from his posture in a single breathless second. Julian finally looked up. Dante Falco stood there. He didn't belong in a room like this, not because he lacked the wealth, but because he lacked the pretense. While the other men in the room wore their tuxedos like costumes, Dante wore his bespoke black suit like a second skin. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from marble and then weathered by a violent storm. Dark, heavy brows framed eyes that were entirely black, unreadable, cold, ancient. He was a man who existed on the fringes of the city's polite society, whispered about in boardrooms, but never spoken of loudly. He owned the shipping ports. He owned the unions. Half the politicians in the room owed their seats to his silent funding, and the other half lived in fear of him. The Falco family didn't just have money. They had power. The kind of power that didn't leave a paper trail. Dante didn't look at Marcus. He didn't acknowledge Derek. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on Julian, and there was something in that gaze that made Julian's breath catch. Something hungry and assessing, like a wolf sizing up a rival pack member. I apologize for the delay, Dante said, stepping smoothly into the space right beside Julian. He didn't crowd him, but his proximity changed the air pressure in the room. Traffic on the bridge. Julian stared at him, his brain scrambling to process the information. He'd never spoken to Dante Falco. He'd seen him once, across a crowded courthouse lobby, surrounded by lawyers who looked terrified of him. He'd designed a building for the Falco Foundation 5 years ago, but he'd never met the family patriarch, just his intermediaries, his lawyers, his endless procession of suits. Before Julian could form a question, he felt the heat of Dante's hand at the small of his back. The touch was light, respectful, but incredibly firm. It sent a jolt straight up Julian's spine, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. Mr. Falco, Marcus stammered. His voice had suddenly gone up an octave. The apex predator had just realized he was standing next to a bigger set of teeth. I didn't realize. We were just catching up. Catching up. Dante repeated the words slowly, flatly. He finally turned his gaze to Marcus. It was like watching a spotlight pan across a dark yard, illuminating every shadow, every hidden thing. Is that what you call it when you corner an Omega to inflate your own fragile ego? Marcus swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. Derek looked terrified, shrinking behind Marcus's arm, his previous bravado entirely evaporated. We were just saying hello, Marcus managed. Julian and I used to be engaged. I'm aware of your history. Dante's voice dropped lower, vibrating with quiet menace. I am also aware of your lack of judgment. It is a flaw that will likely cost you heavily in the coming fiscal year. given the state of your firm's current structural vulnerabilities. Marcus turned the color of ash. It wasn't a vague threat. It was a surgical strike at his business, delivered with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. Dante knew about his firm. Dante had been watching him. But right now, Dante continued, seamlessly shifting his attention back to Julian, his expression softening just a fraction. I am only concerned with my evening. And you are wasting our time. He dismissed them. He didn't ask them to leave. He simply ceased to acknowledge their existence. Dante looked down at Julian, and something in his gaze shifted. The coldness receded, replaced by something warmer. Something almost gentle. Are you ready for that drink? Dante asked quietly. Or do you want to keep hovering by the melting phoenix? Julian looked into those dark, bottomless eyes, and he saw the challenge there. He saw the lifeline being thrown to him in the middle of a freezing ocean. He didn't know what Dante's game was. He didn't know the rules. But he knew that standing next to Dante Falco, he was untouchable. A drink sounds perfect, Julian said, his voice remarkably steady. Dante nodded, but he didn't guide Julian toward the bar. Instead, he turned fully toward him, his hand moving from Julian's spine, sliding up the bare skin of his back to cup the nape of his neck. His fingers were warm, rough with calluses. Julian gasped quietly, his eyes widening. The room around them ceased to exist. Dante stepped into his space, his scent enveloping Julian like a wave. Cedar, and something darker, something electric and wild. It made Julian's knees weak, made his omega instincts purr in approval. Hold still, Dante murmured, his breath brushing against Julian's cheek. Before Julian could process the command, Dante leaned down and kissed him. It wasn't a gentle, polite greeting. It was slow, deliberate, absolutely consuming. Dante's lips moved over his with an authority that demanded response, and Julian gave it involuntarily. He felt the heavy slide of Dante's suit jacket against his bare arms, tasted the faint sharp bite of expensive whiskey on Dante's tongue. The kiss grounded him, tethering him to the floor while the rest of the world spun violently out of control. A collective audible gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass. It shattered loudly against the floor. But neither Dante nor Julian pulled away. Dante's thumb traced the line of Julian's jaw, his grip firm, possessive. Julian's hands fluttered, then landed on Dante's chest, his fingers curling into the crisp fabric of his shirt. His heart wasn't hammering with panic anymore. It was pounding with adrenaline, with something that felt terrifyingly like desire. When Dante finally broke the kiss, he didn't step back. He stayed close, his forehead hovering mere inches from Julian's, his dark eyes locked onto his, stripping away every layer of armor Julian had worn all night. Let them look, Dante whispered, his voice meant only for Julian's ears. Julian blinked, his breathing shallow, his lips tingling. He slowly turned his head. Marcus looked like he'd been physically struck. His mouth was slightly open, his face flushed and ugly, mottled red. The smug arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing realization of his own insignificance. Derek was staring at the floor, visibly shaking. Dante didn't look at them. He simply dropped his hand back to Julian's waist, his grip securely claiming his side. Shall we? Dante asked, his voice returning to its normal calm cadence, as if he hadn't just upended the entire social hierarchy of the room. Julian looked at Marcus one last time. There was no pain left, no embarrassment, just a sudden, vast emptiness where his fear had been. Yes, Julian said, tilting his chin up. We shall. The walk from the ballroom to the valet stand took exactly 2 minutes. But to Julian, it felt like a grueling, suspended hour. Dante kept his hand firmly on the small of Julian's back, a calculated pressure, steering him, but also physically anchoring him to the ground. Julian's knees felt like they were filled with sand. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the confrontation was rapidly burning off, leaving a cold, shaky exhaustion in its wake. The hotel lobby was a blur of gilded mirrors and thick carpeting. The ambient noise of the street seeped in as the heavy glass doors slid open, hitting Julian with a rush of crisp, biting autumn air. He took a sharp breath, his lungs expanding painfully against the tight bodice of his tuxedo. "Breathe," Dante instructed quietly. A black sedan sat idling at the curb. It wasn't a flashy sports car. It was an armored vehicle, heavy and brutally functional. The kind of car designed to take a bullet and keep driving. A man in a dark suit stood by the rear door, his gaze scanning the street over Dante's shoulder. He opened the door as they approached. "Get in," Dante said. Julian hesitated. The cold air was sobering. He looked at the dark interior of the car, then up at Dante's impassive face. 5 minutes ago, he'd been a discarded fiancé, nursing a bruised ego. Now he was standing on a curb with a man the district attorney's office had spent a decade trying to indict. "I have my own car," Julian said. His voice sounded thin, stripped of the bravado he'd summoned in the ballroom. "You have half a glass of cheap champagne in your system and a minor shock," Dante countered, his tone perfectly level. "You aren't driving. And you aren't waiting here for a cab while Marcus regains his courage and comes out to offer you a ride home. Get in, Julian." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The simple, unvarnished logic of his argument dismantled Julian's resistance. Marcus would follow him out. He couldn't stand an unresolved narrative where he wasn't the victor. Julian gathered the fabric of his tuxedo and slid into the back seat. The interior smelled of rich leather and the faint, clean scent of cedar that clung to Dante. The door clicked shut with a heavy, pressurized thud, instantly severing them from the noise of the city. Dante slid in beside him a second later, occupying the space with a quiet, overwhelming gravity. "Drive," Dante said to the man behind the wheel. The car pulled away from the curb, sliding seamlessly into the downtown traffic. Streetlights flickered across the leather seats in a rhythmic, passing glow. Julian pressed his back against the seat, staring straight ahead at the partition, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His lips still held the phantom pressure of Dante's mouth, the sharp taste of whiskey lingering on his tongue. He waited for Dante to speak. He waited for the explanation, the punchline, the reveal of whatever sick bet he was fulfilling. When Dante remained silent, simply watching the city roll by his window, Julian's instincts kicked in. The silence was a tactic. He used it in negotiations all the time. Make the other person uncomfortable enough to speak first. "I charge $800 an hour for architectural consultation, Mr. Falco," Julian said, keeping his gaze fixed firmly on the partition. "So I'd appreciate it if you skipped the theatrics and told me exactly what that performance cost me." Dante turned his head. In the dim light of the cabin, his dark eyes caught the passing glare of a street lamp. A slow, genuine crack of amusement broke the hard line of his mouth. "You think I staged a public spectacle at the Ashford Gala for a free architectural consultation? I think men like you don't do anything for free." Julian shot back, finally turning to look at him. "You don't know me. I don't know you. You didn't just walk up to a crying Omega out of the goodness of your heart. You weren't crying." Dante's tone was flat. "If you had been crying, I would have walked past you. I have zero interest in fragile things. They require too much maintenance." The sheer callous honesty of the statement made Julian blink. "Then why?" Dante shifted his weight, resting his arm along the back of the seat, his fingers mere inches from Julian's shoulder. "Because I despise Marcus Hayes. I despise his firm. I despise his methods. And I despise the fact that he wears poorly tailored suits while pretending to be a master of the universe. Watching him attempt to humiliate you for the entertainment of his peers was offensive to my sensibilities." Julian let out a short, cynical laugh. "Your sensibilities. Right. I forgot about the famous Falco Code of Ethics." Dante didn't flinch at the jab. "I also stepped in because you were holding your ground. You were outgunned. You were outnumbered. And you were standing absolutely still. I respect a person who refuses to bleed for a crowd." He reached forward and opened a small, polished wood compartment between the seats, extracting 2 crystal tumblers and a decanter. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into each glass and handed one to Julian. Julian took it. He didn't drink, just let the warmth of the glass bleed into his freezing fingers. "The kiss," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its confrontational edge. "That wasn't just to make him mad." "No," Dante agreed easily, taking a slow sip of his drink. A handshake would have confused him. A verbal dressing down would have angered him. A kiss terrified him. It told him, and everyone else in that room, that you belong to me now, and no one touches what belongs to me. Julian stiffened. The cold returned, sharper this time. "I don't belong to anyone." Dante looked at him, his eyes stripping him down to the studs. "In polite society, perhaps. But in the world we just stepped into, perception is currency. Marcus knows he can't touch you without inviting my retaliation. You are safe." That was the immediate goal. "And the secondary goal?" Julian asked, his grip tightening on the glass. "We are going to my office," Dante said, turning his attention back to the window. "We have a contract to negotiate." The car didn't stop at a warehouse by the docks. It didn't pull into a shadowy subterranean parking garage. It pulled up to a towering glass and steel high-rise in the financial district, a monument to clinical, aggressive corporate wealth. Dante led Julian through the empty marble lobby. Security guards didn't ask for identification. They simply stood straighter as he passed, tapping key cards to express elevators before he even had to slow his stride. They rode in silence to the 42nd floor. When the stainless steel doors parted, Julian stepped into a space that felt less like an office and more like a fortress disguised as an architectural digest spread. The floors were poured concrete, polished to a dull shine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the city skyline, a grid of yellow lights stretching out into the dark. There were no desks, no cubicles, just a massive slab of reclaimed wood serving as a conference table, surrounded by leather chairs. Dante took his jacket off, tossing it casually over the back of a chair. The simple action changed the dynamic in the room. He looked less like a phantom from the gala and more like a man getting ready for a 12-hour shift. He walked over to a wet bar built into the wall and set his glass down. "Sit," he offered, gesturing to the table. Julian remained standing near the window. "I prefer to know what I'm walking into before I sit down." "Mr. Falco." "Dante," he corrected, pouring himself a glass of water. He leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. The white dress shirt pulled tight across his shoulders. "I know your portfolio, Julian. You spent the last 5 years at Hawthorne Stone, designing commercial and residential properties. You won the AIA Award for the Opera House. You have an impeccable reputation and an eye for detail that borders on obsessive." "Thank you," Julian said dryly. "I assume you didn't bring me here to discuss my awards." "I need an architect," Dante said bluntly. "Specifically, I need an architect who understands how to design for security without sacrificing aesthetics. My family is diversifying. We're buying up legitimate commercial real estate, specifically the waterfront properties on the east side. I need someone who can design a logistical hub that doesn't look like a military installation." Julian frowned. The alcohol and adrenaline were finally giving way to sharp professional clarity. The East Side Development Project. That's being spearheaded by a private equity coalition. A coalition funded entirely by Marcus Hayes, Dante finished. "Yes." Julian felt a sudden, distinct click in his brain. The pieces fell into place with a heavy, metallic thud. "Marcus is blocking your acquisitions." "He's trying to," Dante amended. "He's using zoning boards, environmental impact studies, and historical preservation claims to tie my holding companies up in litigation. He thinks he can bleed me out with legal fees and construction delays. And you want to hire me to design the project?" "I want to hire you to destroy him," Dante said. There was no anger in his voice, just a simple statement of logistical intent. "I want you to design the most spectacular, ambitious, legally unassailable project this city has ever seen. I want you to use every connection you have, every favor you've accumulated, to make Marcus's little coalition look like a bunch of greedy amateurs. And I want you to do it publicly, so he can't back down without losing face." Julian walked slowly to the heavy wooden table, trailing his fingers over the smooth edge. He looked at Dante. You could hire any architect in the city to do this. You probably already have a dozen firms on retainer who specialize in this exact brand of corporate warfare. I do, Dante agreed. But none of them have a personal vendetta against Marcus Hayes. None of them know how he thinks, how he negotiates, or what his weaknesses are. You shared a bed with the man for 5 years. You know where the bodies are buried. I don't know anything about his business dealings, Julian lied smoothly. Dante smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. You're a brilliant, observant Omega who was engaged to a narcissistic alpha. Narcissists brag. He told you things. Maybe you didn't care at the time. But the files are in your head. He walked over to the table, stopping directly across from Julian. I am offering you a position as exclusive lead architect for Falco Holdings, Dante said. I will triple your current salary. I will give you unlimited resources, a dedicated design team, and absolute creative autonomy. Your only mandate is to clear the board for my acquisitions by designing something so incredible that the city council will be begging me to break ground. Julian stared at him. The sheer audacity of the offer was staggering. Dante was handing him a loaded gun and pointing it directly at the man who had ruined his life. It was a deeply vindictive, beautiful proposition. You kissed me in front of 300 people, Julian said, his voice quiet in the cavernous room. You put a target on my back. I put a shield on your back, Dante corrected. Until tomorrow morning, Marcus thought you were a liability, a bitter ex who might cause a scene. Now, he knows you are allied with me. He won't try to smear your reputation in the society pages. He won't try to quietly edge you out of your firm. He is going to be far too busy trying to save his own throat. Julian looked out the window at the city. He thought about Derek's smug smile. He thought about Marcus's patronizing hand gestures. He thought about the last 6 weeks of feeling like a ghost in his own life, apologizing for his own heartbreak. If I take this, Julian said, turning his gaze back to Dante's dark, unblinking eyes, I don't report to your lieutenants. I don't deal with intermediaries. I deal with you exclusively. Dante nodded. Agreed. And if Marcus tries to settle? We don't settle, Dante said flatly. We acquire. Julian let out a long, slow breath. The cynical, rational part of his brain was screaming that this was a mistake. You don't make deals with men who operate in the shadows. You don't let a mobster weaponize your grief. But the grounded, deeply human part of him, the part that had stood freezing next to a melting ice sculpture while the world laughed at him, wanted to burn it all down. Draft the contract, Julian said. I want it on my desk by 8 a.m. If the indemnification clauses meet my standards, I'll sign. Dante's posture relaxed just a fraction. A dangerous, predatory satisfaction settled over his features. I'll have my driver take you home. No, Julian said, picking up his small clutch from the table. I'll call a car. I need the fresh air. He didn't wait for permission. He turned and walked toward the elevators. As the heavy steel doors slid open, he looked back. Dante was still standing by the table, watching him with a heavy, calculating intensity. For the first time in 6 weeks, Julian didn't feel like crying. He felt lethal. The sunlight in Julian's office the next morning was too bright. It sliced through the floor-to-ceiling blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing over his mahogany drafting table. He'd slept for exactly 3 hours. The adrenaline crash had finally taken him around 4 a.m., pulling him into a dark, dreamless sleep. Now, at 8:15 a.m., he was running entirely on bitter black coffee and sheer stubborn momentum. His office at Hawthorne Stone was a testament to his success. A corner suite decorated in muted grays and crisp whites, with a custom drafting table that had cost more than most people's cars. Usually, it felt like a sanctuary. This morning, it felt like a stage. The gossip had beaten him to the building. He'd felt it the moment he stepped off the elevator. The paralegals stopped talking abruptly. The junior associates stared at their shoes as he walked past. Even the receptionist, a woman who'd known Julian for 4 years, handed over his messages with a wide-eyed, terrified expression. Julian kissed Dante Falco. The narrative had mutated, of course. By the time it reached the water cooler, he wasn't just an allied business partner. He was the Mafia boss's new obsession. He was dangerous by proxy. Julian sat at his desk, staring at the thick, cream-colored envelope sitting squarely in the center of his blotter. Dante was a man of his word. He broke the wax seal with his letter opener and slid the contract out. 20 pages of dense, immaculate legalese. He read through it with clinical detachment, highlighting clauses, checking the indemnification phrasing. It was airtight. Dante was offering him an obscene amount of money, a terrifying amount of power, and absolute creative freedom. He picked up his pen and signed the final page with a sharp, decisive stroke. Before he could even set the pen down, his desk phone rang, his direct private line, the one only a few people had. He picked it up without looking at the caller ID. "Julian, please tell me the rumors are a lie." Marcus's voice cracked through the receiver. He sounded ragged. The smooth, patronizing baritone was entirely gone. "Julian, please. Tell me you didn't actually make a deal with him." Julian closed his eyes, letting the sound of Marcus's desperation wash over him. It was better than champagne. Better than silence. "Hello, Marcus," Julian said, his tone conversational, perfectly mirroring the voice Marcus had used on him the night before. "I'm afraid I'm quite busy this morning." "I'm keeping very busy, just like you suggested." "Julian, he's a monster. You don't know what you're doing. He's already pulled the zoning permits on the dock project. My investors are threatening to pull out. You have to call him off." "I don't call him off, Marcus. I just point him." "Why are you doing this?" Marcus shouted, his voice pitching high with genuine panic. "Because of Derek? Because I moved on? It's pathetic, Julian. You're destroying my life over a bruised ego." Julian opened his eyes. He looked at the city outside his window. He thought about the cold, heavy reality of Dante's world and the shallow, pathetic reality of Marcus's. "I'm not destroying your life over an ego, Marcus," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifying deadpan calm. "I'm destroying your life because it's my job. And frankly, you're boring me." He hung up the phone. Before he could even set the receiver back in its cradle, a notification dinged on his computer. An email from an encrypted, unnamed server. He clicked it open, a single line of text. "Good boy. The car will be downstairs at 6 p.m. Dress warmly." Julian stared at the screen. The cold satisfaction in his chest was suddenly replaced by a sharp, electric jolt of anticipation. The game had officially begun. The wind off the harbor tasted like salt, diesel, and decaying iron. Julian stepped out of the black sedan at exactly 6:45 p.m. The high-rises of the financial district were visible in the distance, a grid of glittering gold against the bruised purple twilight. But out here on the industrial piers, the city felt like a rumor. Massive steel shipping containers were stacked like grim, rusted Lego blocks. Floodlights cut through the sea mist, casting long skeletal shadows across the wet concrete. Dante was waiting near the edge of the pier, leaning against the heavy railing, smoking a cigarette. The bright orange cherry flared as he took a drag, illuminating the hard, sharp angles of his face. He wore a heavy wool overcoat, the collar turned up against the wind. He didn't look like a CEO tonight. He looked like the environment he commanded, cold, unyielding, and dangerous. Julian pulled his trench coat tighter around himself, his heels clicking sharply against the pavement, a sound completely swallowed by the rhythmic, groaning crash of the dark water against the pilings. "You told me to dress warmly," Julian said, stopping a few feet away. "You didn't mention I'd be visiting a shipyard." Dante didn't smile. He dropped the cigarette onto the concrete and crushed it slowly beneath the heel of his boot. "You can't understand a war if you only look at the map, Julian. You have to see the dirt." He gestured for Julian to step closer to the edge. Julian did, gripping the icy steel railing. Below them, the black water churned. Across the channel, a massive sweep of waterfront property lay dormant. Chain-link fences topped with razor wires surrounded acres of empty warehouses and cracked asphalt. "That is the East Side Development Project," Dante said, his voice barely louder than the wind. 30 acres of deep water access. Marcus looks at that and sees luxury condos, boutique coffee shops, and a marina for yachts that leave port twice a year. He sees a sterilized playground for the people we drank champagne with last night. And what do you see? Julian asked, turning his head to look at him. Dante kept his eyes on the dead land across the water. I see a logistical throat. Whoever controls that port controls 20% of the commercial freight entering this seaboard. I don't want to build coffee shops, Julian. I want to control the supply chain that brings the coffee into the country. The scale of his ambition hit Julian like a physical weight. Marcus was playing a game of status. Dante was playing a game of empires. He blocked the zoning permits, Julian said, shifting into the analytical space where he felt safest. He used a coalition of shell LLCs to buy up the surrounding residential blocks, then filed environmental injunctions claiming your freight traffic would violate noise ordinances. He bought the local alderman, Dante corrected bluntly, and he's using a dummy corporation based in Delaware to funnel the bribe money as consulting fees. Julian frowned. I can prove the shell companies belong to his firm. Give me a week. The paper trail is always there, no matter how much they pay accountants to bury it. Dante finally turned to look at him. The floodlights caught his dark eyes, making them look completely pitch black. I don't just want you to find the paper trail. I want you to weaponize it. I want Marcus to wake up one morning and find that the ground he's standing on is owned by me. He stepped closer. The smell of the ocean was suddenly replaced by the scent of his cologne, cedar, and smoke. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing a stray lock of hair that the wind had whipped across Julian's cheek. Are you afraid of this? Dante asked quietly. It was a genuine question. There was no mockery in it. Julian looked at the rusted cranes, the black water, and the man standing in front of him. He thought about the sterile, predictable life he'd mapped out with Marcus, the country club dinners, the polite suffocating arguments, the inevitable quiet betrayal. No, Julian said, his voice steady. I'm not afraid. I'm angry. And I am very, very good at my job. Dante's hand lingered on the side of Julian's neck for a fraction of a second, his thumb pressing lightly against his pulse point. He felt the steady, calm rhythm of Julian's heartbeat. A slow, dangerous smile broke across his face. Good, Dante said softly. Then let's go build a guillotine. It took exactly 32 days. Julian didn't sleep much during that month. He operated out of a private conference room on the 42nd floor of Falco Holdings, surrounded by whiteboards covered in design sketches, structural calculations, and property deeds. He designed the most ambitious waterfront development the city had ever seen. A mixed-use logistical hub with sustainable energy systems, public green spaces, and architectural features that would make the city council weep with envy. But more than that, he systematically dismantled Marcus's financial architecture. It was brutal, meticulous work. Marcus wasn't a genius. He was simply a man born on third base who believed he'd hit a triple. He'd over-leveraged his assets, using the same commercial properties as collateral for multiple loans across different banks. His real estate coalition was a house of cards held together by arrogance and fraudulent accounting. Julian found every weakness, every shell company, every hidden debt. He compiled a dossier so comprehensive that even Dante's lawyers were impressed. The killing blow was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the neutral territory of a mediator's office downtown. Julian wore a tailored charcoal suit, his scent carefully suppressed with industrial-strength blockers. He carried a single slim leather briefcase as he walked into the glass-walled conference room. The temperature seemed to drop. Marcus was already there, seated at the head of the long oak table, flanked by two senior partners from his legal team. Derek sat slightly behind him, holding a tablet, looking like a man trying very hard to appear indispensable. Marcus looked terrible. The confident golden boy veneer had cracked, dark circles under his eyes, his suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. The past month of legal hemorrhaging had aged him 5 years. He glared at Julian as he took his seat at the opposite end of the table. This is a waste of time, Marcus snapped, leaning forward. We aren't lifting the environmental injunctions on the East Side docks, Julian. And this pathetic harassment campaign you've been running is bordering on extortion. Julian didn't open his briefcase. He simply folded his hands on the table. I'm not here to negotiate the environmental injunctions, Marcus. I'm here to execute a transfer of assets. Before Marcus could respond, the door to the conference room opened. Dante walked in. He didn't bring lawyers, didn't bring muscle. He walked in alone, wearing a midnight blue suit, projecting a quiet, absolute authority that immediately sucked the air out of the room. Marcus's lawyers physically recoiled, sinking lower into their leather chairs. Dante walked the length of the room and took the seat directly to Julian's right. He leaned back, unbuttoned his jacket, and looked at Marcus with the mild curiosity of a man inspecting a damaged piece of furniture. Proceed, Mr. Hayes, Dante said quietly. Julian finally unclasped his briefcase. He pulled out a stack of 3 thick-bound folders and slid them down the polished oak table. They stopped directly in front of Marcus. What is this? Marcus asked, refusing to touch them. That is a comprehensive audit of your private equity firm, Julian said, his voice crisp and clinical. Specifically, it details the fraudulent cross-collateralization of the Hudson commercial blocks. You used the same 3 buildings to secure loans from Capital Fidelity and Union Mutual, hiding the debt through a shell company in Delaware. A company, I might add, that lists your personal assistant as the primary shareholder. Derek stiffened in his chair, his face draining of color. He looked at Marcus, panic flaring in his eyes. Marcus didn't look at him. He stared at the folders, a bead of sweat tracing the line of his jaw. You hacked our servers. This is inadmissible. I subpoenaed your servers during the discovery phase of the defamation lawsuit I filed against you 3 weeks ago, Julian corrected smoothly. You were too busy panicking over the dock permits to read the fine print of the discovery orders your lawyers blindly signed. He leaned forward, dropping the lofty detachment. He wanted Marcus to feel this. You are bankrupt, Marcus. You're worse than bankrupt, because when the federal regulators see these documents, you are going to federal prison for bank fraud. Silence crashed down over the room. Marcus's lawyers were staring at the documents, rapidly flipping through the pages, their expressions morphing from annoyance to sheer, unadulterated horror. One of them closed the folder, pushed his chair back, and looked at Marcus. We can't represent you in a criminal fraud investigation, the lawyer said, his voice shaking. We're corporate counsel. This is beyond our scope. Sit down. Marcus barked, his voice cracking. He looked wildly across the table at Julian, then at Dante. This is a bluff. You can't just take my firm. I don't want your firm. Dante spoke up, his voice a low, heavy rumble. Your firm is toxic. I want the 30 acres of residential property you bought up around my docks. The property you purchased with those fraudulent loans. Julian pulled a single sheet of paper from his briefcase and slid it across the table. This is a transfer of deed. You are going to sign over the Hudson blocks and the East Side residential properties to Falco Holdings for the sum of $1. In exchange, Falco Holdings will assume the debt on those properties and pay off your fraudulent loans before the banks realize you lied to them. You're stealing it, Marcus whispered, staring at the paper as if it were a loaded gun. You're stealing everything I built. I am saving you from a 10-year sentence in federal prison, Julian replied coldly. Sign the paper, Marcus. Then take whatever liquid cash you have left, pack your things, and get out of my city. Marcus looked at him. Really looked, searching for the soft, compliant Omega who'd once loved him. There was nothing left for him to manipulate. Julian's eyes were flat, hard, and entirely devoid of pity. He picked up the pen. His hand was shaking so violently he had to press his other hand flat against the table to steady himself. He signed the document, the scratch of the nib sounding unnaturally loud in the silent room. He threw the pen down and stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. Are you happy, Julian? Marcus spat, his face twisted in a pathetic, ugly sneer. You ruined me. Over what? Over him. He gestured vaguely toward Derek, who was still sitting frozen in his chair. No, Julian said, carefully sliding the signed document back into his briefcase. I ruined you because it was a Tuesday, and because my client asked me to. Derek had nothing to do with it. He looked past Marcus at the young Omega sitting against the wall. Derek looked terrified, staring at the shattered remains of the powerful alpha he'd hitched himself to. The money was gone. The status was gone. All that was left was a sweating, broke fraud. You should probably call a cab, Derek, Julian said, his tone indifferent. I highly doubt he can afford his car payments this month. Derek stood up, clutching his tablet to his chest. He didn't look at Marcus. He walked quickly out of the conference room, the heavy glass doors shutting behind him with a definitive click. Marcus stood alone at the head of the table. His lawyers had already packed their briefcases, quietly edging toward the door. He was entirely, completely isolated. Dante stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs with slow, deliberate precision. He didn't say a word to Marcus. He simply looked at him, acknowledging his ruin, and then turned his back. Let's go, Julian, Dante said. Julian stood, picked up his briefcase, and walked out of the room. He didn't look back. The penthouse apartment at the top of the Falco Tower was dark, lit only by the sprawling, infinite grid of the city below. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the water. From up here, he could just barely make out the dark industrial smudge of the East Side docks. Tomorrow, construction would begin. The fences would come down. The empire would expand. He heard the soft clink of ice against crystal, followed by Dante's heavy, measured footsteps crossing the poured concrete floor. Dante handed him a tumbler of amber liquid. Their fingers brushed. Dante's skin was warm. To a hostile takeover, Dante said quietly, raising his own glass. To a bloodless war, Julian countered, clinking his glass against Dante's. The whiskey burned going down, sharp and clean. The silence between them wasn't tense anymore. It was comfortable. Over the past month, they'd spent hundreds of hours in each other's orbit. Eating takeout over spread-out blueprints at 2 in the morning, debating design theory in the backs of armored cars. Julian had learned the quiet, brutal rhythms of Dante's life. Dante had learned the sharp, brilliant architecture of his mind. Marcus left the city 3 hours ago, Dante said, stepping up to the window beside him. One-way flight to Miami. No return ticket. Julian took another sip of his drink. He searched himself for a lingering trace of grief, a phantom twinge of the heartbreak that had consumed him 6 weeks ago. There was nothing. Marcus felt like a character from a movie he'd watched a long time ago and didn't particularly enjoy. Good, Julian said simply. Dante turned his head, watching his profile in the dim light. Your contract is officially fulfilled. You cleared the board. You are a very wealthy man, Julian. You could walk away right now, start your own firm, take a year off, sit on a beach somewhere. Julian turned to face him. He looked at the hard lines of Dante's jaw, the dark, assessing intelligence in his eyes. Are you firing me, Dante? He asked, a small, dangerous smile playing at the corner of his mouth. I am giving you an exit, Dante corrected, his voice dropping, taking on that rough, intimate gravity that always made the air in the room feel thinner. Because if you stay, this stops being a transaction. You've seen how I operate. You know exactly what kind of man I am. If you stay, you are in. Permanently. Awake. Strange. He wasn't talking about a professional partnership anymore. He was talking about something deeper. Something that made Julian's heart beat faster. Julian stepped closer. The distance between them evaporated, leaving only the charged electric heat that had been building since the night of the gala. I know exactly what kind of man you are, Julian said, his voice quiet but entirely steady. You're a man who doesn't tolerate fragile things, which is why I fit perfectly into your world. Dante's eyes darkened. The careful, restrained control he always carried himself with seemed to fracture, just a fraction. He reached out, his hand sliding around the nape of Julian's neck, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw. The exact same possessive, anchoring grip he'd used on the night they met. But this time, there was no audience. No performance. You don't just fit into my world, Julian, Dante murmured, his face lowering until his breath ghosted across Julian's lips. You tore it apart and rebuilt it in 30 days. You're terrifying. Is that a complaint? Julian whispered. It's a surrender. When Dante kissed him, it wasn't a sudden, violent consumption like the first time. It was slow, deliberate, acclaiming. Julian let his hand slide up Dante's chest, his fingers curling into the lapels of his suit, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, tasting of whiskey and absolute power. A collision of two people who had finally found an equal in the wreckage. When they finally broke apart, Dante kept his forehead resting against Julian's, his breathing slightly rough. Julian looked past his shoulder, out the window at the sprawling, illuminated grid of the city below. It wasn't just a skyline anymore. It was theirs,